The rasping cough echoed down the sterile white corridor, a sound that had become as commonplace as the whirring of the ventilation system. It had been 5 years since the Great Collapse, the year the novel coronavirus, in its myriad ever-evolving forms, had simply refused to yield. No vaccine had proven universally effective. Aisha tightened the seal of her N95 respirator, the familiar pressure a small comfort in this world of perpetual contagion. Outside the repurposed hospital, once a luxury hotel, now a last bastion of the relatively uninfected, the skeletal remains of Dubai's once glittering skyline pierced the hazy ochre sky. Sandstorms, once a seasonal nuisance, now raged with increasing ferocity, the loosened topsoil a breeding ground for new, terrifying fungal infections that preyed on weakened lungs. Inside, the air filtration system hummed its tireless song, a fragile barrier against the invisible enemy. Aisha, a former architect, now a triage nurse, moved with weary efficiency between the makeshift wards. Each cough, each labored breath, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. They were losing the battle, slowly but surely. The initial waves had culled the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions. But with each mutation, the virus grew more virulent, more indiscriminate. Children, once relatively spared, now succumbed with alarming speed. Her gloved hands trembled as she checked the oxygen levels of a young boy, his small chest heaving. His mother sat beside him, her eyes hollowed out by sleepless nights and the gnawing fear that had become a constant companion. Aisha offered a weak smile, a gesture that felt increasingly futile. The outside world was a patchwork of isolated, heavily guarded enclaves and vast swathes of uninhabited territory. Governments had fractured, unable to cope with the cascading crises. Supply chains had collapsed. The internet, once a lifeline, was now a dangerous echo chamber of misinformation and conspiracy theories, further eroding the already fragile social fabric. Food was a precious commodity cultivated in hydroponic farms within the protected zones. Water was even more so, requiring constant purification to avoid the myriad waterborne pathogens that thrived in the disrupted ecosystems. The simple act of breathing outside the filtered air was a gamble, a roll of the dice with a disease that could leave you gasping for air within days, or worse, transform you into a long hauler, a shadow of your former self, plagued by chronic fatigue, neurological disorders, and a host of other debilitating symptoms. Aisha remembered the before times with a bittersweet ache. The casual freedoms, a walk in the park, a crowded cafe, a hug without a second thought, now seemed like a distant, almost mythical past. The faces of loved ones, unmasked and smiling, were fading in her memory, replaced by the ubiquitous image of masked figures, their eyes conveying a mixture of fear and suspicion. One evening, a new strain hit their enclave. It spread with terrifying speed, even through the stringent safety protocols. The first sign was a peculiar rash, followed by an aggressive pneumonia that conventional treatments couldn't touch. Panic rippled through the hospital. Resources, already stretched thin, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. Aisha found herself working around the clock, the line between day and night blurring into a relentless cycle of care and despair. She watched colleagues succumb, their own immune systems finally overwhelmed. The once bright hotel corridors now felt like a tomb, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of life support machines and the ever-present haunting cough. One night she woke up with a scratchy throat. A wave of icy dread washed over her. She tried to dismiss it as fatigue, the dry air, anything but the truth. But the persistent tickle in her lungs grew into a burning ache. She knew. She stumbled to the small shared bathroom and looked at her reflection in the fogged mirror. The dark circles under her eyes were deeper than usual, and a faint flush crept across her cheeks. The reality hit her with brutal force. She had become what she had fought so hard against. The fear wasn't for death itself, but for the agonizing suffocation, the feeling of her lungs slowly filling with fluid, the terror of being unable to draw a single breath. She thought of her family, isolated in another enclave, their faces masked, their lives circumscribed by the same invisible threat. Would they even know? Would she become just another statistic in a world drowning in them? As the first racking cough tore through her chest, Aisha sank to the floor, the cold tiles pressing against her cheek. The hum of the ventilation system, once a symbol of safety, now sounded like a cruel mockery. The darkness closed in, not just around her, but around the remnants of a world that had failed to contain the invisible enemy. A world now condemned to a slow, suffocating decline. The last thought that flickered through her mind was a desperate plea for a breath that would never come.